Negative, what could you possibly have to say to add a new spin to this conversation? Well, I'll tell you, people blame comics for being too woke and shoving LGBT relations in your face. And I actually kind of agree, but not in the way you probably think. First of all, when it comes to comics right now, I see that comics has a lot of the same problems that Hollywood does. They want to do stuff that's safe. There isn't a lot of risks. Have you seen DC's lineup of comics? Half of them are Batman. And don't get me wrong, I love Batman. I love Batman a lot, but even I don't read all the Batmans. Well, I guess you're just a fake fan then, aren't you? No, I'm just a ding-dong that also likes to read manga, and I can't read all the comics. I like to think of comics and manga following the same road as Hollywood, where right now there's so much boring in Hollywood that people are actually starting to watch foreign films more on like streaming services. And if you actually get the common person to read when watching a movie, you know that Hollywood is really screwing up. But more importantly, touching back on the whole wokeness issue, that's not the core of the problem. It's not the inclusion of more queer characters. It's really just how it's delivered. Manga delivers on that way better than how comics deliver on that. When people talk about comics, they talk about a gay character being shoved in your face. And a lot of times, they kind of do, especially when you compare it to manga. In manga, for lack of a better way to word this, the queer characters are just there. If the story doesn't revolve around them, then typically they'll let you know that they are not straight or cis, and they'll just keep moving along instead of dwell on it like they do in comics. I know it's not manga, but I usually think of Zombieland Saga whenever I think of an example of this, because one of the characters, we found out eventually, just ended up being transgender. But at least in the story, it was actually like relevant to the plot and to that character. There wasn't any build up. They didn't really sit on it. They just said, it's just there. They tell you their backstory, and you need to let you know, hey, this is a thing. We're gonna use this to progress the plot. After that's done, it's done. We may touch up on it a little bit later, but it's mostly just done. And honestly, that's pretty relevant to. That's pretty similar to how it actually happens in real life. You know, you get to a point where your friend feels comfortable enough around you to where they just go, hey, I have something to tell you. By the way, I am attracted to guys, or I am not a guy. It never really feels like there's a show around it when it's not a specifically queer story. And I feel like that is more accepting than what comics do. If you make a big show around it, then it only reinforces how not normal it is. But it's not just the politics. Since politics have always been a major part of comics and manga, it's that comics are caught in the same pitfalls as American politics. We're stuck in a dick measuring contest between the two parties, and it sucks. And if the politics suck, then the comics are gonna suck. And right now, our politics really suck. But there is something to be said as to why comics don't just remove themselves from the politics entirely. If they're doing a bad job, then why would they add it at all? The problem is, we found out it actually helps sales a lot. Before, when asking a marketing agency, they tell you that you should be as apolitical as possible. You don't wanna upset anyone. You wanna be just a brand. Now that is not the case. With the whole age of the internet, that's all changed. We want to identify with brands, and thus the brand will make a stance on something political in order to appeal to their target demographic much easier. It's the major reason why a fast food chain now has a Twitter account talking about how sometimes they fall into a depressive episode. I highly doubt any fast food brand has a brain to do that with. It's to make us relate to that, to make us talk about it, to make us think, oh, I know, I'm gonna go to Wendy's because they're the funny one. And it works a lot of the time. People feel more comfortable going to Wendy's because it has the reputation of being the nicer, friendlier place in your head, even though the physical locations haven't changed in the slightest. And a massive topic that they will weigh in on is LGBT representation. Manga also has plenty of pandering to the LGBT community, but they did it smarter. What they did was they just made it its own genre. They don't try to convince the general populace to be more accepting. They just make stories for queer people, or also people who fetishize queer relationships, that's also, you can't really avoid that. That's also going to be wrapped in there. I mean, sure, sometimes you'll have representation in mainline manga series. Like, I heard of what's happening in One Piece. Don't quote me on that. Yamamoto, I think? Someone? I don't read One Piece, I'm sorry. Or the cute yo-yo girl, Bridget from Guilty Gear. I know that's a fighting game. That's not the same thing, but it's a thing. But they have those characters as characters. They're not the queer characters like they do in comics. I appreciate comics trying to make being gay normal, but making it a big deal happens to make it not normal. It goes against the normalization of all of it. I said it once and I'll say it again, straight people, you don't have to come out to your parents as straight, but for some reason we have to come out to our parents as gay. So long as that sort of stigma exists, we're never gonna be properly thought of as normal. Now, in order to make it properly normal, you gotta sprinkle in some of the fabulous here and there in our stories, but you just don't point a finger to it. You just have it there. It's kind of how it should be. Unless it's a story that actually revolves around the queer experience. In that case, you should point a finger to it because that's kind of the point of the story. Otherwise, it should just be accepted that it's a thing. It should be addressed. It should be like, hey, this is a thing, but it's still just a person. They're still, at the end of the day, it's still just a person. We need to move on. Like Harley Quinn. Why do you think so many people who are LGBT really kin Harley? She's bi, but her coming out felt very real and normal. It was relatable even. She realized she was in an abusive relationship with a crappy guy, and then there was someone else who was a better fit for her. It just so happened that better fit was a woman. It's not even entirely about seeing queer characters in stories. It's more about seeing them in real life spaces. If you go to the manga section at Barnes & Noble, you'll find the gay shit right next to the shonen series. But people who don't resonate with the LGBT stories don't need to worry about accidentally getting that in their shonen. With comics, it can be luck of the draw sometimes. And this is what people mean when they're shoving gayness in their face. It's not that they're homophobic, although a lot of them are. It's that they're upset that they didn't get the story they paid for. It's like buying a fantasy book, but it turns out it's also horror. And if you don't like horror, you're not gonna be cool with that. Hang on, let me backpedal on that, because I just compared LGBT stories to horror, and that's probably not a good comparison. It's like a fantasy story, but you get romance. And if a romance is not your cup of tea, then you're not gonna vibe with it. I know very much so, me being me, sometimes I just want a good old fantasy. Is it nice that it has a lot of LGBT representation? Sure, I like it. I don't necessarily need that there. Sometimes I wanna just distract myself from the everything that is this and just have escapism. Of course, it's never gonna be the luck of the draw with the big money makers. You aren't gonna see much of a shakeup when it comes to series like Superman or Batman. They aren't gonna risk angering the readers when it's their cash cow. That's one of the times they'll actually try to stay out of politics as much as possible. But a series dedicated to Poison Ivy? Sure, why not? Superman? Yikes, probably not. Superman's son? Sure. Don't get me wrong, it hurts that we have to make LGBT stories into its own genre. It feels like we're never truly gonna be accepted. But the point is, we are a minority with a very unique experience, that of which the majority of people will not understand. And you cannot make someone accepting of these kind of people. At least not in the way that comics have been doing it. Changing someone's mind requires them to be willing to change their mind, and that requires a lot of work and a lot of patience. Changing someone's mind is an art. Do not get rid of the LGBT characters in comics. That's not what I'm saying at all. But learn how to deliver those stories in a manner that doesn't distract from what the target audience wants. Clearly, the LGBT community is a market that should be appealed to. The existence of Pride Month sales is proof of that. But in comics, it's approached wrong. You can't blame them for making certain characters bisexual when making the son of Superman bisexual leads to massive sales, so long as it pisses off enough people to get major media attention. I think the smartest thing that DC did was put the pride flag on specifically LGBT stories, because that aligns a lot more with what manga is doing. But the whole wokeness conversation aside, that's not the only reason why comics are failing. It is hard to find comics. You can only find trade paperbacks in Barnes & Noble. If you want floppies, you have to hunt down a local comic shop. Major retailers do not and will not carry floppies. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to manage floppies? Like, displaying them is difficult. You have to have special customized shelves. They don't want to deal with that. You do not make your target audience come to you, you go to them. And which is currently the problem with what's happening with floppy sales. The only reason floppies even really exist now is because we have grading companies and there's a whole collectability aspect to it all, which, so long as there's people like that, we can sucker money out of collectors. Do you really need all 5 different covers of one issue? No, but people buy them anyway. I see people walk into my local comic shop all the time like, hey, I got this alternate cover for you. I'm sure you're gonna like it. Wow, it's a lenticular, whoa, who cares? Floppies, in terms of sales, are a risk. It's common for an issue to run in the red until the trade paperback comes out. Manga doesn't have this problem. They tried releasing individual chapters like in Shonen Jump magazine or in like Dark Horse Comics, the one once upon a time, and that didn't work. So they switched it to single chapters being released digitally, and they sold volumes. Volumes are literally just trade paperbacks, but for manga. Trade paperbacks are omnibuses of floppies. Volumes are omnibuses of chapters. And sometimes volumes will have omnibuses of volumes. We see it all the time. You just get more for your money with manga every time. But not only that, look at how they set up where you see manga compared to comics. And yes, I'm going to hyper focus on Barnes & Noble because like, what other major book retailers are there? Not a lot. Borders is gone. Barnes & Noble is on the rise. Barnes & Noble is becoming like Target where like a bunch of people, including me and my friends, will just go there and just hang out. It's become a hangout destination. Since the malls suck now, Barnes & Noble and Target is where we go. You walk in, the manga is right next to Starbucks. It's close to the sci-fi, the fantasy, the romance, you know, all of the most popular genres in modern literature. And I'm betting they pay to be placed there. If Walmart and Target make you pay for where you want your toys to be placed in the toy aisle for the best optimal discovery, I have no doubt Barnes & Noble is doing the exact same thing. But did you notice, comics are no longer in the same place as manga anymore? Now comics are off with the politics and the nonfiction section, close to the area of dying physical media, like DVDs and CDs. The only reason that section is still justified is because of the resurgence of vinyl records. And also there's people who collect CDs and DVDs. I don't understand that. There's people who do that. There is a market out there. It's falling, it's dwindling, it's not dead yet, but like, we're clearly switching to an all digital age. And this sort of setup, where the location of comics versus manga solidifies that manga is for people who are young and want to hang out with their friends, while comics are made for an older demographic who still cling on to inferior forms of media. And if comic companies realize that that's their audience, then fine. I can't blame them for wanting to shift over there because that's where their target demographic hangs out. That's where they gravitate toward. But it's still a sign that they're losing. There are some things that comics have been doing in order to better appeal to new buyers. Everyone knows that jumping into a series with like 100 issues is daunting. That's true for both comics and manga. Just look at One Piece. I'm never reading One Piece. It's become a chore to read it now. I'm having trouble catching up with Bleach, and that's 75 volumes. It's a daunting task, but I really want to. I can only do that so many times, and I need a long break in between when I do that. And you can argue that technically, with comics, you can jump in with any issue number you want, and you can figure out what's going on pretty fast, and if you don't, usually the arc that of which is happening lasts only like 10 volumes. But most people don't know that, and they will not bother trying. Thus, they've started making a lot of 6-issue miniseries in order to better get around that problem. They want it to be more digestible for people, but they still release it in floppies first before making it into a trade paperback, and you'll most likely not see the trade paperback in major retailers. Now Marvel and DC are both making graphic novels, specifically for major retailers, because they know they need to adapt. But honestly, I tried reading some, and honestly, they just don't hit the same as regular comics. Comics just have a really bad reputation for adapting, and they're still being very slow about it. Frankly, DC and Marvel should make manga, if I'm gonna be frank. They shouldn't adapt their characters into manga. That's not what I'm saying. They should have people create original manga, and they should have people that aren't comic artists, because you wanna like infiltrate. I want an infiltration plan. You gotta get people who draw like anime and manga style and make stories that are good. Obviously, that should be without saying, but sometimes people forget for some reason. Like with Tony Valente and Radiant. He's French. I mean, I'm pretty sure he lived in Japan and he learned in Japan, but hey, point is, technically that's a French-Japanese manga, and it looks like it's just a manga. It looks like if a lot of people didn't know that Tony Valente was originally French, they probably would never have guessed. The artist doesn't need to go to Japan or be Japanese or Korean or whatever. They just need to know the art style. You don't need to be a certain ethnicity to know an art style. And for those making the argument that, but comics are in color and manga is not, therefore comics are better, you're wrong. Clearly, not enough people care. But the conversation around this whole situation is complicated. The surge of relevancy that comic books got with the DCEU and the MCU is slowly fading, especially since a lot of the Marvel movies kind of suck nowadays. And manga has been waiting to take over with a ton of original stories. People have argued that they focus too much on the movies rather than the comics. But when you make so much more money with movies, it's hard not to see why they would focus on the movies. But tell me what you think in the comments below. Tell me if I'm dumb and completely wrong. I'm fully willing to accept that fact. Or maybe you have your own spin on all this. I'd love to hear it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay beautiful and keep playing.